This is the Pick Your Poison podcast. I'm your host, Dr. JP, and I'm here to share my passion for poisons in this interactive show. Will our patients survive this podcast? It's up to you and the choices you make. Our episode today is called Murder in Medicine, Part 2. It's a continuation, and so is a spoiler for Part 1. If you haven't listened yet, I recommend going back and starting there. The king of poisons is such a fascinating topic, it requires 2 episodes to do it justice. Want to know how your organs can turn green? About the controversial start to forensic toxicology evidence? And why our patient isn't responding to treatment? Then stay tuned. This episode starts in the ICU. At a computer in the nurse's station, you review the chart of our 60-year-old patient. If you remember, he presented with abdominal pain, vomiting, and rice water diarrhea. You discovered he is suffering from arsenic toxicity with a spot urine level of 100,000 micrograms per liter. You recommended chelation with dimercaprol to treat the poison. Currently, his vital signs are as follows: blood pressure 89/62 and heart rate 130 beats per minute. This is not good. His blood pressure is low despite the ICU team starting pressors, heavy-duty blood pressure medicines, overnight. And this despite the maximum dose of dimercaprol, the chelator. How was he exposed to arsenic? Why isn't he responding to treatment? There are a number of ways to become poisoned with arsenic. Let's address the first question by talking about the history of arsenic toxicity, because the astonishing prevalence of arsenic in the Victorian era is both interesting and informative. I love to discuss cases. For me, it makes the poisons vivid and memorable rather than dry and dusty. But rather than confuse ourselves with a new patient, if only the ER worked like this, let's instead discuss a few historical cases to highlight the history and the symptoms of arsenic toxicity. The first route of exposure we all know about: murder. Enter historical case 1, the trial of Marie Lafarge. It was very, very sensational at the time and remains famous today. Why? It's the first time forensic toxicology was used in a trial. It was the Marsh test, invented in 1836 by James Marsh, a Scottish chemist, to determine the presence of arsenic post-mortem. So question number 1, true or false? The first time this was used in a trial, it definitively proved guilt or innocence of the accused. A, true. B, false. The answer is B, false. There's no doubt the Marsh test works if done correctly. So, researching the case, I assumed it would be a cut and dry situation with the toxicology results proving the truth beyond a shadow of a doubt. I should have known better. Despite what you see on TV, just like in modern times, toxicology evidence is not as definitive and much more subject to interpretation than anybody likes. I'll share some details with you, then you decide what you think about the verdict. Fair or biased? Marie and Charles Lafarge married in Paris in August of 1839. Before the wedding, he advertised himself as a wealthy man with a palatial estate. This was false advertising. In fact, he had a pile of debts and needed a wife with a big dowry, which Marie had. When she arrived at this estate, she was shocked to find a ruined former monastery infested with rats. Her in-laws didn't trust her, and she felt they were little better than peasants. On her wedding night, Marie locked herself in her room, threatening to commit suicide with arsenic. Eventually, she and Charles reconciled, promising to will each other their assets. She did will her large dowry to him. He did the same, then secretly changed the will, leaving the estate to his mother. In December of 1839, Charles traveled to Paris for business. Marie sends him letters and a Christmas cake, apparently cream puffs. He becomes ill. He returned home. He complained of abdominal pain and diarrhea. His doctor diagnosed cholera and recommended eggnog. While the doctor was there, Marie asked him for an arsenic prescription to kill the rats in Charles's bedroom. Charles has ongoing nausea and diarrhea. He develops leg cramps indicating dehydration, and he dies on January 13th. The family believes Marie poisoned him. A woman staying with the family says Marie put white powder into Charles's eggnog and later into his soup. They become even more suspicious when they discover Marie obtained the arsenic for the rats. Marie says she gave the toxin to the gardener, and indeed, the house is filled with white paste he mixed to kill the rats. Marie takes Charles's will to the notary, unaware that he changed it prior to his death. The family calls the justice of the peace. He asks Charles's doctors if they can perform the new test to detect arsenic, the Marsh test. The doctors lie and say yes. The Lafarge case captured the attention of the news media worldwide. Questions arose about the, quote, Christmas cake Marie mailed Charles. Was it poisoned with arsenic? Who knows, but honestly, you don't need poison to kill someone if you're sending them cream puffs by mail. The media discovered a wealthy classmate and former friend had accused Marie of stealing her jewels years in the past prior to her marriage. The accusations never went anywhere, but now, dredged up, a search revealed the jewels in Marie's house. Marie, she said she was acting as an intermediary between the friend and a blackmailer. The Lafarge family hated Marie and needed her money. At one point, Marie received an incredible 6,000 letters per week. At the trial, local physicians declared there was no arsenic in Charles's body, though they did find it in the eggnog and some other food. Interestingly, analysis of the white paste around the house, untouched by the rats, revealed only flour, water, and soda, no arsenic. In truth, the local physicians didn't know how to perform the Marsh test. Faced with contradictory evidence and vociferous factions of the media and public, both for and against Marie, a famous chemist was called to definitively perform the test. His name was Matthew Orfila, and using the Marsh test, he proved that high levels of arsenic were present in Charles's body and in the food Marie had given him. Do you think Marie Lafarge is guilty? Yes or no? She was pronounced guilty and sentenced to life in prison with hard labor on the basis of this evidence, the first forensic toxicology evidence in history. You'd think that was the end of the story, but no. Another expert called in said Orfila did the wrong test. However, this man arrived too late to testify 4 hours after Lafarge was pronounced guilty. The Marsh test itself works, so that was never in question. How it was performed in this case was the issue. During the trial, both the New York Times and the British Medical Journal doubted the evidence against Marie. Orfila did the Marsh test 3 times. The first 2, using local reagents, were negative. The third test, after an assistant was sent to his lab in Paris, was positive. Now, do you think she was guilty? Yes or no? Questions remain, and I doubt we'll ever know the truth. It's fascinating the controversy surrounding the first use of forensic toxicology isn't really much different than questions which arise in modern trials. The case occurred at the height of what's been called the poison panic in Victorian England. Newspapers published dramatic headlines and fanned the flames of sensationalism regarding arsenic's use in murder. In addition, arsenic was everywhere and in everything at this time. So question number 2. Who wrote in his journal, quote, "It is clear the favorite poison with us is arsenic," end quote? A. Charles Dickens, B. Emily Bronte, C. Arthur Conan Doyle, or D. Oscar Wilde? The answer is A. Charles Dickens. Why use arsenic for murder? It was easy to obtain as it was readily available over the counter as rat poison. It's tasteless and colorless, easy to conceal. And speaking of easy to conceal, poisoning looked like cholera, which was super common at the time, so death was easily attributed to natural causes. Murder wasn't the only way back then to develop arsenic toxicity. It wasn't just in rat poison, but also in medicine. I mentioned last week it was in powders, pills, and even enemas. Fowler's solution, 1% arsenic, invented in 1786 and used up until the 1950s, treated a variety of ailments including psoriasis, syphilis, malaria, and cancer. Charles Darwin actually used it, leading to speculation about the role of arsenic toxicity in his death. It was also found in cosmetics and hair dye. Dr. Campbell's safe arsenic wafers promised a clear complexion. Remarkably, boxes of these arsenic wafers said that they were guaranteed safe and absolutely harmless to anybody. And this was at a time when everybody knew about arsenic toxicity. Users hoped to achieve a milk and roses complexion with pale skin and pink cheeks. The pink cheeks were in fact damaged capillaries. People even went to arsenic hot springs, for example in the Czech Republic, promising transparent skin. When I say arsenic was everywhere, I mean it literally. It even reached the Arctic on expeditions. Charles Francis Hall, an Arctic explorer, may have been murdered on his last trip. He fell ill after drinking coffee, suffered vomiting and delirium, and in his journal accused other members of his party of poisoning him. An investigation in 1986 on his exhumed body did reveal high arsenic levels. Was it murder or medicine? No one knows. Question number 3. Poisoning wasn't only via ingestion. Where was arsenic found in the 1800s? A. Clothing, B. Wallpaper, C. Cosmetics, or D. All of the above? The answer is D. All of the above. Unintentional poisoning by environmental exposure was so common it was literally part of everyday life. Why? In 1814, Paris green dye was developed. It was a beautiful color, very popular and very expensive. It was used everywhere from wallpaper to clothing. It was beautiful and expensive, but also very poisonous. Historical case 2 also captures the attention of the media. In contrast to the Lafarge case, there was no doubt as to the culprit in this tragedy. Matilda Scherer died in 1861. She was a 19-year-old woman employed as an artificial flower maker. Newspapers described her death in lurid detail. The whites of her eyes and fingernails were green. She vomited green waters, convulsed and foamed from the mouth, eyes, and nose. At autopsy, her organs were green. Arsenic was found in her lungs, liver, and bowels. The patient's sister had died under similar circumstances. Matilda worked in a factory making flower crowns. Her job was to dust the leaves of the artificial flowers with powder containing green pigment. 1/8 of a teaspoon of this powder is a fatal dose, and workers were exposed to it by the pound. Newspapers later reported each flower she dusted contained enough arsenic to kill 20 people. Cases like these established the toxicity of green pigment in flowers, fabric, and wallpaper. While arsenic toxicity was well known, it wasn't initially common knowledge that arsenic was part of the dye, and no surprise, these symptoms were dismissed by those in power. William Morris, manufacturer of famously beautiful wallpaper still admired today, said the victims were bitten by witch fever, suggesting they were faking. It wasn't just workers who were sickened. Wearers of dresses dyed with Paris green developed malaise and fatigue, skin ulcers, and hair loss, in addition to systemic poisoning from arsenic absorbed into the bloodstream. The British Medical Journal wrote, quote, "A woman carries in her skirts poison enough to slay the whole of the admirers she may meet within a half a dozen ballrooms," end quote. It wasn't an exaggeration. Dresses were estimated to contain 200 times the lethal dose of arsenic. Wallpaper with Paris green sickened family members after exposure inside their own homes. Humidity and, interestingly, fungus are believed to affect the paper, releasing toxic arsine gas. You may have heard speculation about Napoleon dying from arsenic poisoning, and it's true he had very high levels on post-mortem testing. However, his prison wallpaper contained arsenic, and hair testing revealed very high levels, even in hair from his childhood, making unintentional exposure much more likely than murder. As late as 1950, Claire Luce Booth, the American ambassador to Italy, developed arsenic toxicity from paint chips falling from the ceiling of her 17th century villa into her coffee. There are still concerns about arsine gas release with artifacts such as wallpaper, dresses, and books in museums. What finally stopped the Victorian poison panic? I'd assumed it was the Marsh test, but in fact, cases in British courts increased in the years following its development. Awareness of the toxicity of Paris green certainly helped, but what finally seems to have stemmed the tide is the Sale of Arsenic Regulation Act in 1851, requiring registration of sales by sellers. This act started our modern system of pharmacies and drug regulation. It didn't restrict the sale, but rather required keeping a register of sales. Some complained, asking why only arsenic? There are plenty of other poisons. And the Poison and Pharmacy Act in 1868 addressed this, adding 15 poisons and detailing a system of pharmacy qualification and education. Side note, this act was incredibly important. Pediatric opium deaths dropped from about 20 per million in 1876 to 7 per million in the 1880s thanks to the legislation. Anyway, I could literally go on for forever with nefarious tales of arsenic poisoning and murder. But back to our patient. Is this an occupational exposure? Jewelers, semiconductor manufacturers, and Chinese fireworks manufacturers use arsenic. He's an accountant, so doubtful. He's not getting any arsenicals as medicine, and fortunately, it's no longer in cosmetics. Leaving us with murder. The ICU team called the police after you made the diagnosis a few days ago. It's time for rounds, so let's get to his bedside. You don't need a physical exam. A glance is enough to tell you he's deathly ill. His skin is pale and sweaty. The nurse just changed his soiled sheets. Nevertheless, liquid stool is leaking out of his diaper onto the clean linens. He has a breathing tube down his throat and a feeding tube snaking down one nostril. His arms are bruised from the dimercaprol injections. His wife is at his bedside. She dips a syringe into a Tupperware container on the bedside table, sucking up a thick white liquid. She squirts it down his feeding tube. "He just loves my milkshakes," she says with a smile. "This is the first time you've ever seen a milkshake used as tube feeds. Thank you for taking such good care of my husband." "Well, it doesn't feel like we're taking good care of him. He's not getting better despite treatment." She squirts another syringe full down the tube. "Uh-oh, you figured out why our patient is not improving." You grab the syringe out of her hand, the Tupperware container from the bedside, and run down the hall. She chases after you. You swipe your badge to enter the medroom and slam the door shut behind you. She pounds on the door while you call the police. They charge her with attempted murder. Our patient, free of the poisoned milkshakes, recovers. Barely, but he does. His arsenic levels rising before finally dropping as the exposure stops and the dimercaprol does its job. This is a fictional case, as are all our cases to protect the innocent, but it is based on real poisonings. In this case, a woman convicted of poisoning several husbands, including one while in the hospital, is currently the oldest woman on death row in the United States. Did arsenic poison residents after the 2007 meteorite impact event in Peru? I was very excited when I saw this headline. Poisoning from contact with outer space? Yes! After the meteor struck, about 200 residents complained of nausea, vomiting, and headaches. One theory suggested naturally occurring arsenic in the groundwater liberated by the crater caused the symptoms. Sadly, others noted arsenic levels were the same as drinking sources, casting this theory in doubt. You can't believe everything you read, and this is especially true about suspected poisonings and toxins. The last question in today's podcast. What book describes the death of a main character by arsenic poisoning and is recorded in such great detail the author said they vomited twice while writing it? A. Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None. B. Arthur Conan Doyle's A Study in Scarlet. C. Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary. Or D. Shakespeare's Hamlet. Follow our Twitter and Instagram feeds, both at PickPoison1, and you'll see the answer when I post it. Remember, never try anything on this podcast at home or anywhere else. Finally, thanks for your attention. I hope you enjoyed listening as much as I enjoyed making the podcast. It helps if you subscribe, leave reviews, and/or tell your friends. All the episodes are available on our website, pickpoison.com, Apple, Spotify, or any other location where podcasts are available. Transcripts are available on the website. While I'm a real doctor, this podcast is fictional, meant for entertainment and educational purposes, not medical advice. If you have a medical problem, please see your primary care practitioner. Thank you. Until next time, take care and stay safe.